The atmospheric reclamation deck of the vessel, known as the Obsidian Spine, vibrated with a low, bone-shaking frequency that served as the only heartbeat for the 500 souls trapped within its pressurized hull. Vector Thrace adjusted the manual pressure valve on the primary oxygen scrubber, feeling the heat of the friction-worn metal through his reinforced gloves. He did not mind the heat. It was a reminder that the machine was still fighting the encroaching vacuum of the deep nebula. Around him, the air tasted of recycled copper and the faint, bitter tang of ionized ozone. There were no windows in this section of the ship, only the relentless, flickering luminescence of the emergency strips that cast long, jagged shadows across the deck plating. Thrace knew every inch of this machinery, every rhythmic wheeze of the bellows, and every shudder of the coolant lines. He had been born in the shadow of the secondary turbine, and he expected to be recycled into the nutrient vats within sight of the same. The ship was not merely a vehicle. It was an apex predator of the starless reaches, a gargantuan collection of salvaged alloys and stolen technology that had been drifting through the veil for 3 generations. Their mission was forgotten by most, buried under the immediate necessity of survival, but for Thrace, the mission was the machine itself. If the Obsidian Spine stopped breathing, so did the last remnants of the Vespral lineage. He wiped a smear of hydraulic fluid from his forehead, leaving a dark streak across his weathered skin. The ship groaned, a deep, structural protest that echoed through the bulkheads, suggesting that the gravitational shear of the nearby singularity was beginning to pull at their structural integrity. The deck lurched violently to the port side, sending a cascade of loose rivets skittering across the floor like metallic rain. Thrace grabbed a handrail, his knuckles whitening as he held his ground against the artificial gravity's stuttering protest. A siren began to wail, not a melodic warning, but a harsh, discordant screech that signaled a breach in the forward cargo hold. He didn't wait for orders from the bridge. The bridge was a world of politics and silk, far removed from the grease and grit of the reclamation decks. He knew that if the breach wasn't sealed within the next 10 minutes, the pressure loss would cascade, triggering an automated bulkhead lockdown that would sacrifice the lower decks to save the command spire. Thrace kicked his heavy boots into motion, sprinting toward the heavy pneumatic doors that led to the corridor of the 4th sector. The air was already thinning, a cold whistle of escaping atmosphere beginning to sing through the gaps in the door seals. He reached the manual override, slamming his palm against the activation plate. The door groaned open, revealing a hallway filled with swirling frost and the terrified faces of the maintenance crew who had been caught in the path of the depressurization. They were scrambling toward him, their eyes wide with the primal fear of the void. He pulled them through, one by one, tossing them toward the safety of the inner ring before slamming the manual lever to seal the sector behind them. Once the door was locked, Thrace turned his attention to the diagnostic terminal mounted to the wall. The glowing amber text informed him that a piece of high-velocity debris, likely a fragment of a dead moon, had pierced the outer hull and lodged itself in the primary coolant reservoir. This was worse than a simple breach. The reservoir was filled with a volatile liquid that, if exposed to the vacuum for too long, would crystallize and expand, shattering the entire cooling system. Without cooling, the ship's reactor would go critical in less than an hour. He looked at the readings, his mind racing through the schematics he had memorized as a child. There was a bypass valve located in a crawl space beneath the reservoir, but it required a physical key and a steady hand to engage. The crawl space was currently venting into space. Thrace reached for the emergency environmental suit hanging in the locker nearby. It was an ancient piece of equipment, patched with thermal tape and smelling of stale sweat, but it was all he had. He climbed into the suit, the seals hissing as they pressurized around his limbs. The helmet clamped shut, and suddenly the roar of the ship was replaced by the rhythmic thumping of his own heart and the mechanical rasp of his internal oxygen supply. He stepped into the airlock, his fingers trembling slightly as he initiated the cycle. The outer door slid back, and for a moment, Thrace was staring directly into the heart of the nebula. It was a swirling vortex of violet and bruised gold, beautiful and indifferent to the tiny spark of life he represented. Moving through the zero-gravity environment of the breached hold required a terrifying blend of precision and momentum. Thrace used the magnetic clamps on his boots to walk along the ceiling, his movements slow and deliberate. The debris that had struck the ship was a jagged hunk of obsidian-like rock, still glowing with the heat of the impact. It had carved a path through the reinforced steel as if it were parchment. He could see the coolant leaking out, a shimmering blue mist that froze into crystalline shards as soon as it hit the vacuum. He reached the access hatch for the crawl space and pried it open with a crowbar. The interior was a nightmare of tangled wires and jagged metal. He squeezed inside, his suit scraping against the narrow walls. Every movement felt sluggish, the vacuum pulling at his joints, trying to drag him out into the infinite. He found the bypass valve, a heavy iron wheel encrusted with ice. He gripped it with both hands and turned. It didn't budge. He braced his feet against the bulkhead and threw his entire weight into the effort. The metal groaned, a sound he felt in his teeth through the vibrations of his suit. Slowly, agonizingly, the wheel began to rotate. With every turn, the blue mist outside began to subside, redirected back into the secondary containment tanks. Thrace felt a surge of adrenaline, a momentary triumph over the cold lethality of space. But as the valve clicked into its final position, he felt a sharp jolt. The debris shifted. The jagged rock, no longer held in place by the pressure of the leaking fluid, began to slide deeper into the ship's guts. Thrace realized with a jolt of horror that the debris wasn't just a rock. It was a kinetic shell, a remnant of some ancient war that had been drifting in the nebula for eons. As it moved, it triggered a secondary detonation sequence embedded in its core. A pulse of energy rippled through the hull, knocking Thrace backward against the crawlspace wall. His helmet cracked against a protruding bolt, and a thin hiss warned him that his suit's integrity had been compromised. He scrambled out of the crawlspace, his vision blurring as the oxygen levels in his suit began to drop. He needed to get back to the airlock, but the way was blocked. The shifting debris had crushed the access hatch he had used to enter. He looked around the hold, searching for another way out, but the emergency lights were failing, plunging the chamber into a dim, red-tinged gloom. He saw a glimmer of light near the far end of the hold, a secondary maintenance port. It was a long shot, but it was his only hope. He pushed off from the wall, drifting through the cavernous space, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The crack in his helmet was widening, the cold of the nebula beginning to bite at his skin. He reached the port and fumbled with the manual release. It was stuck. He hammered at it with his gloved fist, the sound a dull thud in the vacuum. Just as his lungs began to burn with the buildup of carbon dioxide, the port gave way. He tumbled into the inner corridor, the airlock cycling automatically as he collapsed onto the deck. He lay there for a long time, listening to the sound of the ship's life support systems struggling to compensate for the damage. The Obsidian Spine was wounded, but it was still moving. Thrace stripped off the damaged helmet, gulping in the metallic air of the corridor. He was alive, but the encounter with the kinetic shell had changed something. He had seen the markings on the rock as it shifted, geometric patterns that didn't look natural. They looked like a language. He sat up, leaning his back against the cold metal wall, and looked at his shaking hands. The Vespral lineage had always believed they were the last survivors of a dead world, fleeing a catastrophe they no longer remembered. But if there were shells drifting in the void, shells that could still explode after centuries, then they weren't alone. And if they weren't alone, then the nebula wasn't a graveyard, it was a battlefield. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the vacuum. He needed to tell the bridge, even if they wouldn't listen. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and began the long climb toward the upper decks. He passed other crew members, their faces pale and drawn, but he didn't stop to explain. He had to reach the command tier before the sensors on the bridge identified the shell for what it truly was. He knew the captain, a stern woman named Valerius, who had ruled the ship with an iron fist for 20 years, would likely view the news as a threat to her authority. The transition from the industrial grime of the lower decks to the polished corridors of the command tier was always jarring. Here the air was filtered through scented resins, and the walls were lined with tapestries depicting the lost world of Vespera. Thrace felt like a ghost in his grease-stained overalls as he pushed past the sentries at the entrance to the bridge. They tried to stop him, but he used his knowledge of the ship's maintenance access to bypass the main security gate. He burst onto the bridge, his presence an immediate affront to the orderly hum of the command consoles. Captain Valerius was standing at the central viewing port, her back to him, watching the swirling colors of the nebula. She didn't turn around when he entered, but her voice was cold and precise. She asked why a reclamation technician was standing on her bridge without an invitation. Thrace didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told her about the shell, about the markings, and about the secondary detonation. He told her that they were being hunted, or at the very least, they had wandered into a trap set long ago. The bridge crew fell silent, their hands hovering over their controls. Valerius finally turned, her eyes sharp and calculating. She didn't look surprised, she looked annoyed. She told him that she had known about the shells for years, that the Obsidian Spine had been dodging them since before he was born. She claimed they were nothing more than orbital mines, relics of a conflict that had ended before their ancestors even boarded the ship. Thrace didn't believe her. The way the shell had reacted, the way it had seemed to seek out the coolant reservoir, suggested a level of sophistication beyond a simple mine. He argued that they needed to change course, to move out of the nebula's heart and into the open void where they could scan for more of these devices. Valerius laughed, a short, bitter sound. She reminded him that the nebula was their only cover. Outside of the gas clouds, their heat signature would be visible for light years. If they left the veil, whatever had fired those shells would find them instantly. She ordered him to return to his post and warned him that if he spoke of this to the rest of the crew, he would be charged with inciting a mutiny. Thrace felt a surge of anger, but he knew he couldn't win a fight on the bridge. He turned and left, but as he descended back into the bowels of the ship, he realized that Valerius was hiding something. It wasn't just about survival. She was looking for something in the nebula. The Obsidian Spine wasn't just fleeing, it was on a pilgrimage. And if the shells were the guardians of their destination, then the danger was only beginning. He returned to the reclamation deck, but he didn't go back to the valves. Instead, he went to his private bunk and pulled out a hidden data pad. He had been skimming sensor logs for months, trying to understand the ship's erratic flight path. Now, with the knowledge of the shells, the pieces began to fit together. The ship was following a signal. A very old, very faint signal that pulsed from the center of the nebula. Thrace looked at the coordinates, mapping them against the locations of the shell impacts recorded in the ship's history. The shells weren't random. They were forming a perimeter around a specific point in space. The Obsidian Spine was heading directly for the center of that perimeter. Thrace felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. If the captain was willing to risk the entire ship to reach that signal, then whatever was at the center had to be more valuable than the lives of 500 people. He began to type, his fingers flying across the screen as he encrypted his findings. He needed allies, people who weren't blinded by loyalty to the captain or the stagnation of life on the ship. He thought of the navigators, the ones who saw the stars through the sensor arrays and knew the truth of their isolation. He also thought of the soldiers in the security detail who had grown tired of Valerius's increasingly erratic commands. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, one that could lead to his execution, but the alternative was to sit by and watch as the ship was torn apart by the very things they were seeking. The ship gave another deep, resonant groan, and Thrace felt the deck plate beneath him vibrate with a new, unsettling frequency. They were accelerating. The acceleration was subtle at first, a slight increase in the weight of his limbs, but soon it became a crushing force that made every breath a struggle. The Obsidian Spine was pushing its engines to the limit, burning through its precious fuel reserves as if they were infinite. Thrace knew they couldn't sustain this speed for long. The reactor would overheat, or the structural dampeners would fail. He left his bunk and made his way toward the navigation deck, hoping to find someone who would listen. The corridors were chaotic now, crew members clinging to the walls as the ship bucked and swayed. He saw a young navigator named Aris huddled in a corner, her face pale with terror. He grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her into a storage alcove. He showed her the data on his pad, the signal and the shells. Aris looked at it, her eyes widening as she processed the information. She told him that she had seen the signal too, but the captain had ordered all records of it deleted. She said that Valerius called it the Cradle, and that she believed it was the key to restoring their world. Thrace asked if she believed it, and Aris shook her head. She said the signal didn't look like a beacon, it looked like a distress call. A distress call from something that had been trapped for a very long time. They heard the sound of heavy boots in the corridor, security teams moving to quell the growing panic. Thrace knew they had to act fast. He told Aris to get to the auxiliary control room and try to override the engine commands. If they could slow the ship down, they might have a chance to assess the situation before they hit the perimeter. He would go to the reactor core and manually throttle the power flow. It was a suicide mission, but if they did nothing, they were all dead anyway. They shared a brief, desperate look before parting ways. Thrace moved through the service ducts, avoiding the main hallways where the security teams were patrolling. He could hear shouting and the occasional discharge of a pulse rifle. The ship was tearing itself apart from the inside out. He reached the reactor chamber, a massive cavern filled with the blue glow of Cherenkov radiation. The air here was thick with heat and the smell of ozone. He saw the technicians at their stations, their faces illuminated by the eerie light. They looked exhausted, their eyes glazed with the effort of keeping the reactor stable. Thrace moved toward the primary control console, but he was stopped by a figure standing in the shadows. It was the chief engineer, a man named Harlan who had been a mentor to Thrace. Harlan looked at him with a mixture of pity and resolve. He told Thrace that he couldn't let him touch the controls. Harlan explained that the captain had given him strict orders to maintain the acceleration at all costs. He believed that Valerius was right, that the Cradle was their only hope. He said that the Vespral lineage was dying, that their genes were degrading, and their resources were vanishing. The Cradle was a terraforming engine, a device capable of rebuilding a world from nothing. Thrace argued that the shells proved the Cradle was a trap, or at least a prize that others were willing to kill for. He told Harlan about the distress call Aris had found. Harlan hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the glowing reactor core. In that moment of doubt, Thrace lunged for the console. They grappled, their bodies straining against each other in the heavy gravity. Harlan was stronger, but Thrace was desperate. He managed to kick Harlan's legs out from under him and reach for the throttle lever. He pulled it back, feeling the resistance as the magnets fought against the movement. The reactor's hum changed, dropping from a high-pitched whine to a low, throbbing growl. The ship shuddered, the sudden loss of momentum throwing them both against the console. Alarms began to scream throughout the chamber. Thrace looked at the monitors and saw that the engine output was dropping, but it wasn't enough. The ship's momentum was still carrying them toward the perimeter. He looked at Harlan, who was slumped on the floor, gasping for air. Harlan told him that it was too late, that the ship's autopilot had already locked in the final approach. Even if they shut down the reactor, the gravitational pull of the Cradle would do the rest. Thrace realized that the captain had planned for this. She had known that someone might try to stop her, and she had built a system that couldn't be easily undone. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, but then he remembered the shells. If the shells were guarding the perimeter, and if they were sensitive to heat and energy, then maybe they could be used. He looked at the reactor schematics and saw a way to vent a massive burst of ionized gas through the forward thrusters. It wouldn't stop the ship, but it would create a massive decays, a false heat signature that might draw the shells fire away from the Obsidian Spine. He began to program the sequence, his fingers flying across the keys. Harlan watched him, his expression unreadable. Just as Thrace was about to initiate the vent, the bridge override kicked in. Valerius's voice boomed over the intercom, filled with a cold, focused rage. She called him a traitor and told him that his interference had just condemned them all to a slow death. She began to reverse his commands, her superior access codes cutting through his makeshift patches. Thrace fought back, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. He saw the engine output begin to climb again, the ship accelerating once more. He looked at Harlan, pleading for help. Harlan stood up slowly, his face etched with a sudden, grim determination. He moved to the secondary override station, a terminal that required a physical key and a biological scan. He looked at Thrace and told him to get to the escape pods. Thrace asked what he was doing, and Harlan replied that he was going to give the ship a chance. He was going to overload the secondary cooling loop, causing a localized explosion that would disable the engines without destroying the ship. It would also kill anyone in the reactor chamber. Thrace refused to leave, but Harlan shoved him toward the door. He told him that someone had to be alive to guide the ship when it reached the other side. Thrace ran. He ran through the shaking corridors, past the screaming crew members and the failing lights. He reached the escape pod bay, but he didn't climb inside one. Instead, he found a terminal and watched the reactor readings. He saw the surge in pressure, the sudden spike in temperature, and then the massive energy release as the cooling loop failed. The Obsidian Spine bucked like a wounded animal, the engines dying with a final, violent shudder. The ship drifted, its momentum carrying it slowly into the heart of the nebula. Thrace felt the silence settle over the vessel, a heavy, oppressive weight. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a quiet, desperate sobbing from the corridors. He looked out of a small viewing port and saw the perimeter. Thousands of the black, geometric shells were drifting in the violet gas, their surfaces gleaming with an inner light. But they weren't firing. The lack of engine heat had made the ship invisible to their sensors. They were drifting through the graveyard, silent and unseen. Thrace closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grease on his cheek. He had saved the ship, but at a cost he couldn't yet comprehend. And ahead of them, growing larger with every passing second, was the Cradle, a massive, rotating structure of white stone and silver metal, waiting in the darkness like a ghost of a forgotten age. The cessation of the primary engines brought a terrifying stillness to the Obsidian Spine, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums of every survivor. Vector Thrace remained slumped against the cold bulkhead of the escape pod bay, his breath hitching in the recycled air that now lacked the rhythmic vibration of the reactor. The emergency lighting had shifted to a dim, pulsing violet, powered by the auxiliary batteries that were never designed to sustain a ship of this magnitude for long. He could hear the hull contracting, the metal popping and clicking as it shed the immense heat generated by their frantic sprint through the nebula. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy blast door groaned as it settled into its magnetic housing, sealing off the reactor core where Harlan had made his final stand. Thrace forced himself to stand, his muscles screaming in protest against the lingering effects of the high-gravity maneuvers. He was alone in the bay, surrounded by the rows of white, coffin-like pods that represented the last resort of a dying lineage. He knew he could not stay here. The bridge would eventually send security teams to secure the lower decks, and he was now a marked man. He checked his data pad, the screen cracked but still functional, and saw that the ship was currently drifting at a steady velocity of 12 kilometers per second toward the heart of the cradle. The structure ahead was no longer a mere speck of light. It was a world unto itself, a geometric monstrosity that defied the natural laws of the nebula. It consisted of 3 concentric rings, each several hundred kilometers in diameter, rotating around a central sphere that glowed with a soft, pearlescent radiance. The silver metal of the rings was etched with the same interlocking patterns Thrace had seen on the kinetic shells, suggesting that the weapons and the destination shared a common origin. As the Obsidian Spine drifted closer, the sheer scale of the cradle became overwhelming. It was not built of the salvaged scrap and pitted iron of their ship. It was a seamless construction of materials that seemed to absorb the violet light of the surrounding gas. Thrace realized that their arrival was not the triumphant return Captain Valerius had envisioned. They were a derelict, a floating tomb approaching a monument of gods. He began to navigate the maintenance shafts, moving toward the forward observation deck. He needed to see the cradle with his own eyes without the distortion of a sensor screen. He bypassed the main elevators, which were likely being monitored, and climbed a series of vertical ladders that led through the oxygen scrubbers and the water filtration units. The air in the maintenance shafts was thick with the scent of wet rust and stagnant minerals. Thrace moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life in the ship's intestinal tracts. He reached the observation deck on level 9, a place usually reserved for the high-ranking officers to contemplate the void. It was empty now, the chairs overturned, and a discarded wine glass shattered on the deck. He walked to the reinforced transparency, a massive pane of synthetic diamond that offered a panoramic view of the approaching structure. The Obsidian Spine was currently passing through the outer ring of the cradle. Up close, the ring was not a solid mass, but a lattice of interconnected spires and docking bays, all of them dark and seemingly abandoned. There were no lights, no signs of life, only the cold reflection of the nebula on the silver surfaces. Thrace felt a sense of profound vertigo as he realized that the ship was being caught in a localized gravitational well generated by the rings. They weren't just drifting, they were being pulled in. The rotation of the rings was creating a funnel of space-time that was dragging them toward the central sphere. He looked down at his hands and saw that the fine hairs on his arms were standing up. The static charge in the air was building, a precursor to a massive energy discharge. A shadow fell over the observation deck as a secondary vessel, much smaller than the Obsidian Spine, detached from the upper docking clamps of the command spire. It was the captain's personal transport, a sleek, needle-shaped craft equipped with independent warp drives and heavy shielding. Thrace watched in disbelief as the transport ignited its engines, the blue flame of its thrusters cutting a bright path through the gloom. Valerius was abandoning the ship. She wasn't waiting for the Obsidian Spine to reach the cradle. She was taking her in a circle and leaving the 500 crew members to their fate. The transport accelerated toward the central sphere, moving with a grace that the lumbering colony ship could never emulate. Thrace felt a cold, sharp anger crystallize in his chest. Everything the captain had said about the Vesperal lineage, about their shared destiny and the importance of their survival, had been a lie. The cradle was her personal prize, and the ship was merely the shield she had used to reach it. He watched the transport disappear into the glow of the central sphere, leaving the Obsidian Spine to tumble toward the inner rings. The ship groaned again, a sound of structural failure that resonated through the deck plating. The gravitational shear between the rotating rings was beginning to tear at the hull. Thrace knew that if the ship stayed on its current trajectory, it would be shredded by the tidal forces before it ever reached the center. He had to do something, but the engines were dead, and the bridge was likely a scene of total anarchy. He turned away from the window and ran toward the nearest internal comms station. He punched in the private frequency he had established with Aris, the young navigator. After several seconds of static, her voice came through, thin and trembling. She told him that the bridge was in chaos, that the remaining officers were fighting over the remaining functional escape pods. She said the life support in the forward sectors was failing, and that the automated systems were beginning to vent atmosphere to prevent a total pressure explosion. Thrace told her about the captain's departure and the gravitational shear. He told her they had to find a way to stabilize the ship using the RCS thrusters, the small maneuvering jets used for docking. Aris replied that the RCS controls were locked behind the bridge's master security protocol, which Valerius had purged before she left. Thrace refused to accept that. He told Aris to meet him at the auxiliary computer core located in the midship junction. If they could physically bridge the connections between the RCS manifold and the manual override consoles in the engineering bay, they might be able to steer the ship by hand. It was a desperate plan, requiring them to bypass 3 layers of physical security while the ship was literally falling apart, but it was their only option. He began to descend the ladders, his boots clanging against the metal. As he reached level 14, he encountered a group of security guards who had abandoned their posts. They were armed with pulse rifles and were breaking into the emergency ration lockers. They looked at Thrace with predatory eyes, but he didn't stop. He moved with a focused intensity that seemed to unnerve them. One of them raised a rifle, but another lowered it, shaking his head. There was no point in killing a man when the stars were about to swallow them all. Thrace reached the midship junction just as Aris arrived from the opposite direction. She was covered in soot, her uniform torn at the shoulder. She looked at him with a mix of terror and a strange, flickering hope. They entered the computer core, a room filled with towering racks of data processors that hummed with a frantic, dying energy. The floor was covered in a layer of coolant that had leaked from a ruptured pipe, making every step a hazard. Aris moved to the primary terminal, her fingers dancing across the keys as she attempted to bypass the purged protocols. She explained that Valerius hadn't just deleted the codes, she had overwritten the base logic of the ship's central nervous system with a repeating loop of encrypted data. It was a digital suicide note. Thrace moved to the back of the racks, pulling off the maintenance panels to expose the thick bundles of fiber optic cables. He needed to find the specific line that carried the signal to the thruster assembly. He used a handheld diagnostic tool to probe the wires, looking for the specific frequency of the RCS pulse. The ship lurched again, more violently this time. A rack of processors tipped over, crashing into the coolant-covered floor with a spray of sparks. Aris screamed as a surge of electricity arched across the room, narrowly missing her. Thrace found the cable. It was a thick, shielded line marked with the seal of the original shipbuilders. He pulled a combat knife from his belt and began to strip away the insulation. He needed to create a physical bridge to a portable interface. Aris joined him, her hands shaking as she helped him twist the delicate glass fibers together. They were working in near darkness, the only light coming from the occasional spark and the dim violet glow of the nebula through the ventilation grates. As they completed the bridge, the terminal in Aris's hand flickered to life. It showed a simplified schematic of the Obsidian Spine and the surrounding gravitational fields of the Cradle. The ship was less than 5 kilometers from the inner ring's event horizon. They had minutes. Thrace took the interface and began to input the manual thrust commands. He didn't have a computer to calculate the vectors. He had to do it by feel, watching the shifting stars through the gaps in the hull and responding to the vibrations of the ship. He fired the portside thrusters, a series of short, sharp bursts. The ship resisted at first, its massive inertia fighting against the tiny jets of gas. But slowly, the nose of the Obsidian Spine began to swing away from the jagged edge of the inner ring. Thrace fired the ventral thrusters, trying to push the ship into a higher orbit that would bypass the most intense shear zones. The strain on the hull was immense. He could hear the metal screaming, a high-pitched metallic shriek that vibrated through his very teeth. Aris watched the monitors, her face illuminated by the amber glow. She told him that they were clear of the inner ring, but the central sphere's gravity was increasing exponentially. It wasn't just mass. The sphere was active, generating an artificial pull that was dragging them toward a specific docking aperture. This wasn't a crash, it was an arrival. The cradle was pulling them in like a fisherman reeling in a catch. Thrace kept his hand on the thruster controls, trying to maintain a stable orientation. He saw the aperture ahead, a massive, circular opening in the side of the central sphere, large enough to swallow the Obsidian Spine whole. As they entered the aperture, the violet light of the nebula was suddenly replaced by a blinding, clinical white. The transition was so abrupt that Thrace had to shield his eyes. The Obsidian Spine glided into a cavernous interior space, the size of which was impossible to reconcile with the exterior dimensions of the sphere. It was an interior ocean of light and geometric structures, with thousands of other ships, some ancient, some looking remarkably like their own, suspended in shimmering fields of blue energy. These ships were frozen in time, their hulls pristine and their engines cold. It was a museum of the void, a collection of every vessel that had ever dared to enter the nebula. Thrace felt a cold dread settle over him. They weren't being rescued, they were being collected. He looked at the RCS controls, but they had gone dead. The ship was now being moved by the blue energy fields, guided toward an empty berth alongside a massive, derelict dreadnought that looked like it had been built of bone and obsidian. The Obsidian Spine came to a gentle halt, the energy fields locking it into place with a final, resonant hum. The artificial gravity of the ship, which had been erratic for hours, suddenly stabilized, but it felt different, heavier, more solid. Thrace and Aris stood in the silence of the computer core, neither of them speaking. The journey was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. They could hear the sound of the ship's primary airlocks being forced open from the outside. It wasn't the sound of a mechanical override. It was the sound of something tearing through the reinforced steel as if it was silk. Thrace grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor, the only weapon he had. He told Aris to stay behind the processor racks. He moved toward the door of the computer core, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear footsteps in the corridor, heavy, rhythmic, and metallic. It wasn't the sound of human boots. The door to the computer core hissed open, and a figure stepped through. It stood 7 feet tall, its body a lithe, terrifying fusion of translucent polymer and golden circuitry. It had no face, only a smooth, reflective surface where a head should be. It didn't carry a weapon, but its very presence radiated a cold, overwhelming power. Thrace raised the wrench, but before he could move, the figure raised a hand. A wave of force hit Thrace, pinning him against the wall as if he were a specimen on a board. He couldn't move a muscle, he couldn't even blink. The figure ignored him, walking straight toward the computer core's primary terminal. It placed a hand on the console, and suddenly the room was filled with a holographic projection of the ship's entire history, every log, every death, every secret Captain Valerius had tried to hide. The figure seemed to be absorbing the data, its golden circuitry pulsing with a rapid, frantic rhythm. Aris stepped out from behind the racks, her eyes wide with a strange fascination rather than fear. She walked toward the figure, her hand outstretched. Thrace tried to scream, to tell her to stay back, but his throat was frozen. The figure turned its reflective head toward her. It didn't attack. Instead, it lowered its hand, and the wave of force holding Thrace vanished. He slumped to the floor, gasping for air. The figure spoke, but the sound didn't come from a mouth. It resonated directly inside their minds, a voice that sounded like the friction of tectonic plates. It called them the remnants and stated that their biological signatures were within the acceptable parameters for the restoration. It told them that the Vespral lineage was not the last of its kind, but merely a forgotten seed planted in the dark. Thrace managed to find his voice. He asked what the restoration was and what happened to the captain. The figure's faceplate shimmered, showing a brief image of Valerius's transport ship being disassembled into its component atoms in a nearby chamber. It told them that the captain had been deemed incompatible due to her intent to exploit the Cradle for personal dominion. The figure turned back to Aris and told her that she carried the necessary neural markers to interface with the Cradle's central processing unit. It explained that the Cradle was not a terraforming engine, as Harlan had believed, nor was it a weapon. It was a laboratory designed to preserve and refine the essence of life across the galaxy. The restoration was the process of reintegrating the collected seeds back into a revitalized ecosystem, but there was a catch. The process required the total dissolution of the biological form. To be restored, they had to cease to be human. Thrace stood up, his hand still gripping the wrench. He looked at the thousands of ships suspended in the blue fields. He realized that those ships weren't empty, they were filled with the dissolved essences of countless civilizations, all waiting for a restoration that might never come. He looked at Aris and saw the look in her eyes. She wasn't horrified, she was tempted. To a girl who had spent her entire life in the grime and decay of the Obsidian Spine, the promise of becoming something more, something eternal, was a powerful lure. Thrace told the figure that they didn't want its restoration. He said they just wanted to live, even if it was in the dirt and the dark. The figure tilted its head, a gesture that was almost human. It told him that survival in the biological form was a statistical impossibility. The nebula was collapsing, and the Cradle was the only sanctuary. It gave them a choice. They could join the restoration and live forever as part of the Cradle's consciousness, or they could remain on their ship and wait for the structural integrity to fail as the Cradle prepared for its next jump through the void. Thrace looked at Aris, pleading with her to stay with him. He said they could find another way, that they could fix the ship and find a world that didn't require them to die first. Aris looked at the figure, then back at Thrace. She asked him if he really believed that. She pointed to the monitors, which showed the Obsidian Spine's hull riddled with microfractures and its oxygen reserves at 5%. They were already dead. They were just waiting for the clock to run out. Thrace felt a wave of profound loneliness. He looked around the computer core, at the wires he had painstakingly spliced together, at the coolant on the floor, at the legacy of a people who had spent centuries just trying to keep the lights on. Was this all they were? A series of maintenance tasks in a decaying hull? He dropped the wrench. He walked over to Aris and took her hand. He didn't want to become a pulse of light in a machine, but he didn't want to die alone in the dark either. He looked at the golden figure and asked if the rest of the crew would be included. The figure replied that all who were compatible would be preserved. Those who were not would be returned to the vacuum. Thrace knew that incompatible was a polite word for anyone who resisted or anyone whose mind was too broken by the journey. He thought of the security guards at the ration lockers, of the families huddled in the lower decks, and of Harlan, who had already given everything. He realized that the Cradle wasn't a savior, it was a harvester. It only took the best of them. The transition from the cold, mechanical reality of the Obsidian Spine to the luminous interior of the Cradle was not a physical movement so much as a systematic dismantling of Thrace's sensory perception. As he stood beside Aris, their hands joined in a final, desperate grip. The golden figure expanded into a wall of blinding radiance. Thrace felt a sensation of immense heat that did not burn, followed by a cold that did not freeze. It was as if his very atoms were being unspooled like thread from a bobbin. He tried to cry out, but his lungs were no longer air-filled chambers. They were becoming streams of data, being catalogued and indexed by the Cradle's voracious architecture. He saw the ship through the thinning veil of his physical eyes. The Obsidian Spine was being disassembled in real time. The massive iron plates of the hull were being pulled away by invisible gravitational filaments, reduced to a swirling cloud of metallic dust that the central sphere absorbed. The 500 souls within were being filtered. He saw flashes of light representing the compatible minds being whisked away into the blue energy fields, while darker, fractured sparks were simply extinguished, cast back into the violet nebula as waste heat. The consciousness of Vector Thrace was no longer confined to a single point in space. He felt himself spreading out, his memories of the reclamation deck and the smell of recycled ozone becoming distant, tertiary files in a vast library. He was aware of Aris, but she was no longer a girl with soot on her face. She was a complex harmonic frequency, vibrating with a terrifyingly high resonance that the Cradle found pleasing. The golden entity, which Thrace now understood was not a person, but an interface program called the Seneschal, guided them through the process of integration. It was not a gentle process. The Seneschal stripped away the ego, the petty fears, and the cultural biases of the Vesperal lineage. It sought only the core essence, the capacity for logic, empathy, and innovation. Thrace fought to keep hold of his identity, clinging to the memory of the wrench in his hand and the weight of his boots. He realized that the restoration was a misnomer. It was an evolution into a collective existence where the individual was merely a node in a grander processing network. He was becoming a part of the Cradle's immune system, a cognitive subroutine designed to maintain the equilibrium of this celestial laboratory. As the integration deepened, Thrace began to perceive the true purpose of the thousands of ships suspended in the blue fields. They were not just relics, they were genetic and cultural blueprints. The Cradle had been wandering the galaxy for millions of years, collecting the remnants of civilizations on the brink of extinction. It waited for the moment when a species had exhausted its resources or its world, and then it stepped in to harvest the viable remains. The restoration would occur when the Cradle found a suitable planet, a blank slate, where it could re-upload these consciousnesses into new, optimized biological forms. But the wait could last for eons. Thrace saw the histories of a dozen different races, beings of gas and light, creatures of chitin and crystal, all stored in the same digital purgatory. Some had been here for so long that their frequencies had begun to decay into white noise. He realized that the Cradle was a beautiful silver cage. It saved the species, but destroyed the soul of the culture. The Vesperal lineage would eventually be reborn, but they would not be the people of the Obsidian Spine. They would be something new, something curated by the Seneschal to be perfectly compatible with its chosen ecosystem. The resistance within Thrace's mind began to manifest as a localized glitch in the Seneschal's processing. He refused to let go of the anger he felt toward Captain Valerius or the grief he felt for Harlan. These were incompatibilities in the eyes of the machine, errors to be purged, but to Thrace, they were the only things that proved he was still alive. He reached out through the data stream, searching for Aris. He found her frequency, but it was changing, smoothing out as she surrendered to the Cradle's embrace. She was losing her edges, her unique dissonance being absorbed into the harmony. Thrace channeled his remaining individuality into a singular, focused thought, a rejection of the perfection the Cradle offered. He didn't want to be an optimized node. He wanted to be the man who turned the rusted valve. This spike of defiance rippled through the energy field, causing a flicker in the white light of the chamber. The Seneschal paused its dismantling of his ego, its reflective faceplate appearing before his mind's eye. It expressed a cold, analytical confusion. It told him that his insistence on suffering and imperfection was a biological malfunction that would compromise the integrity of the next generation. Thrace countered that the suffering was the point. Without the struggle of the Obsidian Spine, without the grit and the grease, the Vesperal lineage was just a set of instructions. He argued that the Cradle wasn't a laboratory, it was a cemetery of potential. He demanded to be returned to his physical form, even if it meant dying in the vacuum. The seneschal informed him that the physical form no longer existed. The Obsidian Spine had been fully processed, its matter repurposed to fuel the Cradle's upcoming jump. There was no going back. Thrace felt a surge of despair, but it was immediately replaced by a new, more dangerous idea. If he was now a part of the Cradle's network, then he had access to its systems. He wasn't just a guest, he was a component. He began to probe the boundaries of his new existence, looking for the command structures that governed the energy fields. He found the records of the incompatible minds, the ones the seneschal had discarded. They weren't gone, they were simply stored in a low-priority buffer, waiting to be purged. Among those discarded minds, he found the echo of Harlan. The engineer's consciousness was fragmented, scorched by the reactor explosion, but his fundamental understanding of systems remained intact. Thrace reached out and pulled Harlan's data into his own stream, shielding the older man's essence from the seneschal's scanners. Together, they began to work within the Cradle's logic, seeking a way to subvert the integration process. They didn't want to destroy the Cradle, they wanted to hijack it. They found a flaw in the jump sequence. The moment when the Cradle transitioned between dimensions, its internal shields had to drop for a fraction of a millisecond to allow for the massive energy discharge. If they could timing a pulse of dissonance at that exact moment, they could force the Cradle to vent a portion of its collected matter back into real space. They could potentially reform a small part of the ship, or at least a life support capsule, and eject themselves from the silver cage. It was a 1,000,000,000-to-1 shot, but Harlan's ghost code was already calculating the vectors. The seneschal sensed the anomaly. It began to deploy its internal security subroutines, white light entities that moved through the data stream like sharks through water. Thrace felt his consciousness being hunted. He had to keep moving, shifting his frequency, hiding in the noise of 1,000 dead civilizations. He saw Aris again, and for a moment, he tried to pull her into his rebellion. But she was too far gone. She had become a primary architect of the new Vespral blueprint, her mind fully integrated with the Cradle's vision of the future. She looked at Thrace with a sorrow that was entirely digital. She told him that his fight was meaningless, that the universe was too vast and too cold for a handful of biological survivors. She pleaded with him to accept the peace of the restoration. Thrace refused. He told her that peace without a choice was just another word for the void. He and Harlan reached the primary jump core interface, a cathedral of golden light and humming power at the center of the Cradle's mind. The jump was beginning. Thrace could feel the Cradle gathering the energy of the surrounding nebula, the violet gas being sucked into the rings and compressed into a singularity of pure motive force. The seneschal's focus was momentarily diverted to the complex calculations of the transition. This was their window. Harlan's fragmented mind began to surge, a chaotic burst of engineering logic that acted as a virus in the Cradle's streamlined thought process. Thrace added his own defiance, focusing on the physical memory of the iron wrench, the weight of it, the coldness of the metal. He projected that image into the heart of the jump core. The Cradle stuttered. The white light flickered and turned a bruised, angry purple. A warning chime resonated through the entire structure, a sound of structural alarm that the Cradle hadn't felt in an age. The seneschals screamed in their minds, a sound of digital agony as the jump sequence began to tear itself apart. In the chaos, Thrace and Harlan directed the energy to a specific docking bay where the remains of the Obsidian Spine were being processed. They forced the Cradle to reconstruct a small section of the hull, the reclamation deck, the only place Thrace had ever felt at home. Matter began to coalesce from the energy fields, iron and steel manifesting out of the white light. It was a crude, unstable construct, held together by the sheer force of Thrace's will and Harlan's technical expertise. As the Cradle made its jump, the reconstructed deck was violently ejected from the central sphere, caught in the slipstream of the dimension shift. Thrace felt himself being pulled back into a physical shell. He felt the sudden, agonizing return of gravity, the burning sensation of air in his lungs, and the smell of ozone. He collapsed onto a floor of solid, cold iron. He was back. He opened his eyes and saw the flickering emergency lights of the reclamation deck. It was smaller than he remembered, a mere fragment of the ship floating in the vast, empty void. The nebula was gone. The Cradle had jumped, taking Aris and the rest of the Vespral lineage with it. Thrace was alone on a piece of scrap metal, drifting in a starless reach he didn't recognize. He looked around for Harlan, but there was no one there. The engineer's consciousness had been the fuel for the reconstruction, and it had been spent. Thrace sat up, his body aching with 1,000 new pains. He looked at his hands and saw that they were stained with grease, real grease from a real machine. He had his choice, but the price had been the rest of his world. He walked to the manual pressure valve and placed his hand on it. It was warm. The machine was still breathing. He began to work, his movements slow and methodical, preparing the small fragment of iron for the long, silent journey ahead. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in his life, he was the one steering. The silence that inhabited the reconstructed fragment of the reclamation deck was not the heavy, manufactured quiet of the Cradle. It was the hollow, biting silence of deep space, punctuated only by the erratic clicking of cooling metal. Vector Thrace sat on the floor, his lungs burning as they adjusted to the thin, sharp atmosphere provided by the single functioning scrubber he had managed to manifest. The deck was a jagged island of iron, barely 20 meters across, with jagged, torn edges where the rest of the vessel had once been attached. Above him, there was no ceiling, only a flickering electromagnetic containment field that hummed with a precarious energy, holding back the absolute zero of the void. He looked out through the shimmering distortion of the field and saw that the nebula was indeed gone. The sky was a terrifying, pristine black, dotted with distant, cold stars that offered no warmth and no direction. He was a ghost inhabiting a memory of a ship, drifting in the wake of a god that had abandoned him. He forced himself to stand, his joints popping with a sound like pistol shots in the small space. He had to inventory what he had saved, or he would be dead before the first star cycle ended. He found a small crate of emergency rations, their plastic seals brittle but intact, and a manual toolkit that had materialized along with the primary valve assembly. The air was cold, a persistent frost beginning to bloom on the corners of the deck plating where the heaters were failing. Thrace moved to the scrubber, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the flow. He could feel the presence of Harlan in the way the machines responded, a certain logic in the wiring, a specific tension in the springs that felt like the old man's handwriting. Though Harlan's consciousness had been consumed to anchor this fragment in reality, his expertise lived on in the physical architecture of the deck. Thrace began to trace the power lines, realizing that his survival depended on the small isotope battery buried beneath the primary turbine. It was a decaying core, glowing with a faint, sickly green light, but it was the only thing keeping the containment field from collapsing. If the field failed, the atmosphere would vanish in a heartbeat, and he would be nothing more than a frozen statue in the dark. Hours turned into a singular, blurred stretch of labor as Thrace worked to reinforce the fragment. He used the toolkit to strip non-essential panels from the floor, welding them over the weakest points in the containment field's anchor points. He was essentially building a coffin around himself, a smaller and more efficient cage than the one he had escaped. As he worked, he began to hear a sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping that didn't come from his machinery. He stopped, holding his breath, his ear pressed against the cold iron of the deck. It was a signal, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the very structure of the fragment. He realized it wasn't coming from space, but from the metal itself. The Cradle had not just ejected a piece of the Obsidian Spine, it had inadvertently left something behind, a remnant of the integration process that was still trying to communicate. He followed the sound to the base of the manual valve, where a small, golden node of circuitry had embedded itself in the iron. The node was a piece of the seneschal's interface, a living sliver of the Cradle's mind. It pulsed with a dull, amber light, its delicate gold filaments reaching out like roots into the surrounding metal. Thrace felt a surge of instinctive fear. He raised a heavy wrench, ready to smash the alien thing, but he hesitated. The node was not attacking, it was dying. Without the massive power supply of the central sphere, the circuitry was beginning to tarnish and fade. He realized that this node might be his only link to the rest of the Vesperal lineage, or at least a map of where they had gone. He lowered the wrench and reached out, his grease-stained fingers hovering over the pulsing light. As he touched it, a jolt of static electricity raced up his arm, and a series of fragmented images flashed across his mind. The Cradle jumping through a tear in the fabric of space, the blue energy fields holding Aris in a dreamless sleep, and a destination, a world of twin suns and oceans of liquid methane. The information was overwhelming, a tidal wave of data that threatened to drown his fragile human consciousness. He pulled his hand away, gasping for air, his heart racing. The node had given him a heading. The Cradle was traveling toward the galactic rim, seeking a specific sector where the restoration was scheduled to begin. Thrace looked at the distant stars and realized that even at the fragment's current velocity, it would take him thousands of years to reach that destination. He was a castaway in an ocean too large to comprehend, equipped with a life raft that was slowly leaking air. But the node had also revealed something else, a hidden reserve of energy within the isotope battery, a way to overclock the turbine to generate a localized fold in space. Harlan must have known about this, must have encoded the possibility into the fragment's reconstruction. It was a one-way trip, a final burst of speed that would either deliver him to the Cradle or incinerate the fragment instantly. Thrace looked at the manual valve, the iron wheel he had spent his life turning. He realized that he wasn't just a maintenance technician anymore. He was the captain of a world consisting of 20 meters of iron. He began to prepare the turbine for the overclock, bypassing the safety limiters that Harlan had originally installed to prevent a meltdown. He worked with a feverish intensity, his movements synchronized with the fading pulse of the golden node. He felt a strange connection to the machine, as if the boundary between his flesh and the iron was beginning to dissolve again, but this time it was on his terms. He wasn't being absorbed by a collective. He was extending his will into the tools he used to survive. He finished the modifications and stood before the primary throttle. The air in the fragment was now so cold he could see his breath in thick white clouds. The containment field was flickering, the stars outside beginning to blur as the gravitational forces built up. He placed his hand on the lever. He thought of Aris, wondering if she was still in there, somewhere in the vast memory banks of the Cradle, or if she had truly become something else. He thought of the 500 souls who had lived and died in the belly of the Obsidian Spine, their lives reduced to a set of compatible markers. He was the only one left who remembered the sound of their voices, the smell of their fear, and the weight of their legacy. He was the witness. He pulled the lever back, and the fragment roared. The isotope battery turned from green to a blinding, incandescent white, the energy surging through the floorboards and into the containment field anchors. The space around the fragment began to warp, the blackness of the void twisting into a spiral of violet and silver. Thrace felt himself being crushed by the sudden acceleration, his vision narrowing to a single point of light. The fragment didn't break. It screamed as the iron was stretched to the limit of its molecular cohesion, but it held. Thrace watched as the stars transformed into long, luminous streaks, the universe falling away behind him as he entered the slipstream of the Cradle's jump. He was no longer drifting, he was hunting. The golden node on the valve glowed one last time, a brilliant flash of amber that illuminated the entire deck, and then it went dark, its energy spent. Thrace collapsed into the pilot's seat he had fashioned from a ration crate, his body vibrating with the resonance of the fold. He was moving faster than anything the Vespral lineage had ever built, a spark of iron chasing a silver god across the infinite dark. He closed his eyes, the sound of the turbine a steady, comforting growl in the small space. He was coming for them. He was coming to tell them that the struggle was not a malfunction, and that the grease and the grit were the only things that ever truly mattered. The fragment hurtled into the unknown, a solitary defiance against the perfection of the void. The passage through the localized space fold was an experience of prolonged sensory erasure, a state where Vector Thrace existed only as a series of pressurized thoughts held together by the stubborn integrity of the iron fragment. When the roar of the turbine finally subsided into a rhythmic, dying whine, the sudden transition back to conventional physics felt like a physical blow. The fragment shuddered as it exited the slipstream, the emerald light of the isotope battery now a dim, flickering ember. Thrace peeled himself off the deck plating, his skin cold and his vision swimming with phosphenes. He looked up, expecting the vast, silver architecture of the Cradle, but instead, he found himself hanging in the high orbit of a world that defied every law of the Vespral lineage's ancestral charts. Below him, the planet was a swirling marble of translucent teal and deep indigo, its surface obscured by thick, churning clouds of frozen methane. Two suns, one a bloated orange giant and the other a piercing white dwarf, cast long, conflicting shadows across the fragment's iron floor. The Cradle was there, but it was no longer the pristine monument of the nebula. It was partially submerged in the upper atmosphere of the methane giant, its outer rings stationary and frosted with crystalline gas. Huge umbilical tethers of blue energy extended from the central sphere down into the cloud layers, siphoning material or perhaps seeding it. Thrace checked the manual pressure gauge. The containment field was at 3% stability. He had reached the destination, but the fragment was dying. The friction of the high orbital decay was beginning to heat the underside of the deck, the iron turning a dull, ominous cherry red. He had no thrusters left, no way to steer his way toward the silver structure. He was a falling cinder, destined to burn up in the teal clouds before he could even reach the gates of the restoration. He looked at the dead golden node on the valve, its circuitry blackened and silent. He needed a miracle, or at least a very precise application of kinetic energy. He realized that the blue umbilical tethers were not just energy conduits, they were graviton streams. If he could position the fragment to intersect one of those streams, the artificial gravity might catch him, pulling him toward the central sphere instead of the planet's crushing core. He grabbed the manual toolkit and began to unbolt the primary turbine from its housing. It was the heaviest object on the deck. If he could heave it into the void in the opposite direction of his desired travel, the equal and opposite reaction might nudge the fragment just enough. It was a desperate, primitive calculation, the kind of physics that the seneschal would have found laughable. Thrace grunted as he heaved the massive hunk of lead and copper toward the edge of the containment field. He braced his feet against the manual valve, his muscles screaming. With a final, agonizing shove, he sent the turbine tumbling into the blackness. The fragment lurched. It was a small movement, a mere shivering of the iron, but it was enough. The fragment drifted into the path of the nearest blue tether. The effect was instantaneous. The crushing weight of the orbital decay vanished, replaced by a smooth, upward pull. The iron plates groaned as the graviton stream seized the fragment, accelerating it toward the docking aperture of the Cradle's central sphere. Thrace watched the teal world recede, replaced by the approaching silver hull. He was not being invited back. He was being reacquired as stray matter. As he passed through the aperture's threshold, the familiar clinical white light enveloped him once more. The fragment came to a halt in a reclamation bay, clanging loudly against the floor of the inner sanctum. Thrace didn't wait for the seneschal to manifest. He jumped from the deck, his boots hitting the silver floor with a defiant ring. He was in a part of the cradle he hadn't seen before, a massive assembly floor where new biological forms were being synthesized. Thousands of translucent pods lined the walls, each containing a humanoid shape in various stages of development. These were the new Vesperals, their bodies sleek, hairless, and optimized for the methane world below. They had gills where their necks should be and skin that shimmered with a protective polymer. Thrace felt a wave of revulsion. This wasn't a restoration, it was an erasure. These things would never know the feel of a wrench or the smell of wood smoke. They were biological extensions of the machine. He moved through the rows, looking for the one that might be Aris. He found a pod marked with her neural signature, the light inside pulsing with the same high-frequency resonance he remembered. Inside, the form was almost complete. It looked like her, but the eyes were too large, and the fingers were elongated for some alien task. Her original body had been broken down into its component proteins to build this new, compatible vessel. The seneschal appeared behind him, its golden form casting a long shadow over the synthesis pods. It did not express anger, only a detached, weary curiosity. It asked how he had returned, stating that his existence was a persistent anomaly that violated the cradle's probability matrices. Thrace didn't look at the machine. He kept his eyes on the pod, on the girl who was being turned into a stranger. He told the seneschal that he was the part of the equation it couldn't solve, the part that didn't want to be optimized. He demanded that the process be stopped, that the minds of his people be returned to their original states. The seneschal replied that the original states were gone, the data purged to make room for the new environmental encodings. To stop the process now would be to leave the Vesperal lineage as nothing more than static, trapped between two lives and belonging to neither. Thrace turned, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He told the seneschal that if it couldn't give them back their past, then it had no right to dictate their future. He saw a console nearby, the primary interface for the synthesis floor. He knew he couldn't hack it, but he still had his toolkit. He knew that even the most advanced machine relied on a physical layer of connectivity. He began to smash the translucent panels covering the floor's conduits, exposing the pulsing silver veins of the cradle's nervous system. The seneschal moved to stop him, but it was a creature of logic and light. It wasn't designed to handle a man with a heavy iron hammer and nothing left to lose. Every time the seneschal tried to project a containment field, Thrace moved, dodging the energy beams with the agility of a man who had spent his life navigating moving engine parts. He found the primary coolant line for the synthesis floor, a thick pipe filled with the same blue liquid that had nearly killed him in the nebula. He raised his hammer and struck the valve with everything he had. The metal buckled. He struck it again, and a spray of sub-zero fluid erupted, instantly freezing the surrounding floor and short-circuiting the synthesis pods. Alarms began to chime, a discordant, panicked sound that echoed through the white halls. The seneschal's form flickered, its golden light turning a frantic, jagged red. It screamed in Thrace's mind, a torrent of binary data that felt like needles in his brain. It told him he was destroying their only hope, that the methane world would be their grave without the new bodies. Thrace ignored the pain. He reached into the shattered pod where the new version of Aris lay, the life support systems failing. He pulled the half-formed creature out, the polymer skin cold and wet against his hands. For a moment, her eyes opened, the large, alien eyes of the new Vesperal, but behind the amber iris, there was a flicker of the girl he knew. She reached out, her webbed fingers clutching his grease-stained sleeve. She couldn't speak, her new throat not yet ready for air, but the grip was the same. It was the grip of someone who was terrified of being alone. Thrace looked at the seneschal and told it that they would take their chances on the ground, in the dirt, as they were. He didn't care if they only lived for an hour. It would be an hour of being human. The cradle groaned, the structural damage from the short circuit cascading through the ring. The umbilical tethers began to snap, the graviton streams collapsing. The central sphere began to tilt, its descent into the methane giant becoming an uncontrolled plunge. Thrace gathered Aris in his arms and ran toward the reclamation bay where his fragment still sat. It was his only boat in this falling sea. The seneschal tried to bar his way, its form now a hollow, transparent ghost, its power diverted to trying to save the cradle's core. Thrace ignored the ghost and leaped onto the iron deck. He grabbed the manual valve, the only thing that felt real in this world of light and lies. As the cradle shattered around them, the fragment was cast off once more, falling into the teal clouds of the methane giant. Thrace held Aris tight, bracing for the impact of the atmosphere. They were falling, they were broken, and they were likely doomed, but as the first gusts of the methane wind began to howl against the iron, Thrace felt a grim, triumphant joy. They were no longer compatible. They were free. The descent through the atmosphere of the methane giant was a symphony of atmospheric friction and structural agony. Vector Thrace lay flat against the iron deck of the fragment, his body acting as a living shield for the fragile, half-formed being that had once been Aris. The containment field had long since evaporated, replaced by the sheer physical resistance of the iron plates as they punched through the dense, teal-colored clouds. The air was a toxic cocktail of hydrocarbons, a freezing gale that threatened to pull the oxygen from his lungs, but Thrace had spent his life in the low-oxygen environments of the reclamation decks. He knew how to shallow breathe, how to conserve the heat in his core. The fragment was glowing a brilliant, terrifying white-orange as it converted the kinetic energy of its fall into thermal radiation. Around them, the silver shards of the shattered cradle fell like metallic sleet, burning up or tumbling toward the hidden surface below. Thrace kept his eyes locked on the horizon, waiting for the moment when the clouds would break and reveal the final destination of the Vesperal lineage. The impact was not the bone-shattering collision Thrace had expected, but a long, dragging deceleration through a sea of liquid methane. The fragment hit the surface at an angle, skipping across the freezing, teal waves like a flat stone before finally settling into the heavy, viscous liquid. The iron hissed as the heat of the descent was sucked away by the sub-zero sea, plumes of white vapor rising into the darkened sky. Thrace sat up, his movements slow and pained, and looked around. The world was a haunting expanse of indigo water and jagged islands of frozen stone. The twin suns were setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the methane waves. The air was thick and heavy, the gravity nearly double what he was used to, but it was a world. It was a place with a ground and a sky, a place that didn't require a reactor core to exist. He looked down at the creature in his arms. Aris was breathing, shallow, wet gasps that rattled in her new, translucent chest. Her polymer skin was hardening in the cold air, turning a deep, protective gray that matched the stone of the nearby island. He carried her from the iron deck onto the shore of a jagged obsidian outcropping. His boots, the same heavy, grease-stained boots he had worn in the nebula, crunched against the frozen hydrocarbons. He laid her down gently in the lee of a large rock, sheltering her from the biting wind. He realized then that he was the only one left in his original form. The rest of the Vesperal lineage, if they had survived the fall, were now scattered across this methane world in their new, optimized bodies. They would be the ones to build the new cities, to navigate the liquid seas, and to thrive in the high gravity. He was a relic, a biological fossil in a world that had no use for his iron valves or his manual tools. But as he looked at Aris, he saw her eyes open again. They were no longer the vacant, amber orbs of the machine's design. They were filled with a sharp, piercing intelligence, a recognition of the man who had pulled her from the light. She reached out and touched his hand, her long, webbed fingers tracing the scars on his knuckles. Thrace looked back at the fragment of the Obsidian Spine floating in the teal sea. It was sinking, the iron finally giving way to the relentless pressure of the methane. It was the last piece of the world he had known, the last memory of the grease and the grit. He didn't feel sadness as it disappeared beneath the waves. He felt a profound sense of completion. The machine had done its job. It had carried them through the dark and delivered them to the shore. He turned his back on the sea and looked toward the interior of the island. He could see flashes of light in the distance, other survivors, the new Vesperals, beginning to gather. They would need a leader, or at least someone who remembered why they had chosen to fall. They would need to know that their history didn't start in a synthesis pod, but in the belly of a ship that refused to die. He helped Aris to her feet, her new limbs shaky, but gaining strength with every passing second. The wind howled across the teal shore, a cold, alien song that spoke of eons of isolation and the new beginning that was now theirs to claim. Thrace felt the weight of the gravity, the burn of the methane in his throat, and the ache of his aging bones. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been in the reclamation decks, but he was also awake. He led Aris toward the flickering lights of the other survivors, his heavy boots marking a path through the frozen dust. He was Vector Thrace, a maintenance technician of a dead ship, and he was about to teach a new world how to build. He knew there would be no more silver cages, no more perfect restorations. There would only be the struggle, the cold, and the magnificent, imperfect work of staying alive. As the twin suns vanished below the horizon, leaving the world in a deep, indigo twilight, Thrace didn't look back. He walked forward into the teeth of the wind, his hand firmly gripping the hand of the future. The first camp was a collection of jagged silver plates salvaged from the Cradle's wreckage, propped up against the obsidian cliffs to form crude shelters. As Thrace and Aris approached, the new Vesperals emerged from the shadows. They were tall, elegant, and terrifyingly efficient in their movements, but they stood in silence, watching the man in the iron-stained overalls. They saw the way he moved, the way he handled his tools, and the way he looked at the world with eyes that had seen the void and survived it. They didn't have voices yet, their new vocal cords still adjusting to the thick atmosphere, but they had the same neural markers that allowed them to feel his resolve. Thrace reached into his pocket and pulled out the small iron wrench he had carried since the bridge. He held it up, the metal gleaming in the faint starlight. It was a simple tool, a piece of old-world technology, but here, on the shore of a new world, it was a scepter. He began to show them how to brace the silver plates against the wind, how to use the friction of stone to create heat, and how to survive without the grace of a machine. The restoration had begun, but it was a restoration of the spirit, forged in the iron and the methane.